Thank you everyone for joining today's corporate housing session. For today's session, what I'm going to do for this session is basically I'm going to walk you guys in regards to a couple of different scenarios. In this particular instance, we use three out of the four acquisition strategies, which if you guys have gone through some of the course and some of the training, is that you own, properties that you're doing arbitrage on, so you rent and then sublease, properties that you co-host, meaning that you do some kind of level property management on behalf of an owner that already furnished a property, and then the last one is lease matching. So for this session, I'm not going to talk about lease matching. I'm basically going to focus on the other three strategies and how they were applied for each one of the properties that we sourced to finish up with this $66,000 contract. So just to give you a little bit of background, in terms of our company, we do a couple different things. Primarily, we're investors, so we are buying properties. And so there's properties that we own, and then we essentially lease it to our corporate partners. We also provide services to homeowners that are struggling with their long-term rentals. Some of the things that you often come across is people aren't really getting any cash flow with their properties. Maybe they're cash flowing maybe a couple of $100s. And so we are able to provide them a solution through arbitrage by being able to become essentially their guest. And then they allow us to provide the housing for our corporate partners. And then on top of that, we also do property management, which essentially I'll walk through some of the different scenarios here as well. We've been in business for a couple of years now. And I believe last time I checked, we have access to around 3,000 properties across the US. So if you guys are in our network and have those properties in our network, just know that our clients are looking at those properties and they know that the quality of properties that you guys have as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually share my screen. And so let me open up the first one. It might take me a little while. Cool. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Can you guys see my screen, by the way? Just say, say yes if you guys can see it. Awesome. Pretty cool. All right. So this property, 10194 Lothborough Circle. You guys can see the listing here. You guys can have a look at that. But essentially, this is what the property looks like. This property, it's like in the high end of Fishers, Indiana. If you guys are familiar with Indiana, and by the way, all these properties are in Indiana. This is what the properties look like. This one in particular, it's a co-hosting property. What that means is that we are actually helping a homeowner that heard about midterm rentals. They didn't necessarily like the aspect that they actually are business owners, but they didn't like the aspect of having a second job as a short-term rentals. And at least based on the current interest rates, they weren't really thinking of getting some good cash flow when it came down to their rental property. So they decided in the middle ground, just kind of knowing some of the benefits for corporate housing, just for the quality of the tenants, the potential payout that they could get, and also making sure that they had a professional on their corner to be able to provide support. They essentially decided to do more on the corporate housing side. So this house in particular, it's fenced in. It's got, if I remember correctly, this one's a 2.5. It's almost 3,000 square feet. It's a huge property. I know some properties in California are really relatively small, but this one in particular, it's a pretty high-end property. So I'm going to show you guys some of those properties so you guys can have a look in regards to the quality of the properties. So this next one, 422 Cedar Crest. So this one is in Columbus, Indiana. It's about an hour and a half south of Indianapolis from where that location is. This one is a 3.5. This is actually a property that we own. So this one we actually bought. Initially, we bought it with a conventional loan, and then we just been holding it for a long time. We actually put up a lot of our own funds into this deal, furnished it. As you can see, it's got a really nice backyard. It's completely fenced in. It's a bedroom, 2 bathroom house. This one I wish we would have taken the pictures on the summer just because of all the flowers and floristry that you get within this particular property. As you guys can see, these are pretty high quality properties as well. The last one, and this one is 1019 Central Avenue. Yeah, 1019 Central Avenue. So this property is a property that we are arbitraging. So what that means is that basically a landlord was in a situation that they bought this house, they bought it with high interest rates. So in terms of the cash flow that they were getting for their long-term renters, they weren't really gonna get that much for a long-term lease. And By working with us, they're saving their 10% management fee from a real estate agent that would manage the property on their behalf. And then on top of that, they're getting a little bit above market rent by renting to us because there's a little bit of more risk just because we are renting it to strangers that they don't know about. They haven't run the background checks or credit checks on any of them. We're responsible for those. So we're able to pay a little bit higher market rent. So this is kind of what the properties look like. But I believe this one's a four, 2.5 bathroom house. As you can see here, the qualities of the furnishings and the way we set that up. By the way, my partner Evelyn, she did all this, so I can't take any of the credit for the decoration. So she did an amazing job on this as well. So this one's a four, 2.5, almost 3,000 or 2,500 square feet. The owner did too good of a job finishing it up to the point that basically that helped pivot that scale to wanting to book to higher quality tenants. So in terms of the properties, this is what we're looking at here. So just to take you in regards to the actual what actually happened and basically some of that information, I'm going to share with you guys what the lease agreements look like, what the terms look like, as well as some of the payouts. But I'll share with you also what the story is behind securing these bookings. So let me know if you guys can see. It should be a Word document. It should have a lease. It should have a strategy, the terms, length of stay, and the book value for those properties. So in this particular instance, for Lothbury, the first property that you guys saw, this one, we had a scenario. We're working directly with State Farm, so it's an insurance relocation claim. We have been trying to make relationships over in the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce. We've actually been to a couple of different events. For this particular instance, what we ended up doing is we actually connected directly with an insurance agent. Now, with insurance agencies, basically what they try to do is they would go through ALE Solutions, CRS, a couple of different relocation companies. And when we connected with them, we basically explained to them what we did. That essentially we're local, we're providing housing solutions here in the Indianapolis area. And essentially they connected the dots. It's like, hey, right now we're paying all this money to ALE. Actually, in this case, it was CRS Temporary Housing. If you guys are familiar with that relocation company, they were essentially going to be paying thousands and thousands of dollars more to CRS for them to essentially do what we're trying to do. From the initial conversation, we actually connected directly with the policyholder. They essentially explained to us the situation. In this case, they lost their entire house. It was due to a fire. They had their belongings there, and actually, they were displaced there for about 2 weeks into a hotel. So initially, it wasn't that bad in terms of how long they had been displaced. But just from the emotional side and how they were expressing it, actually, it made us feel like this is something that's urgent. It's something that they need to have. In this particular case, policyholders actually spoke Spanish. I don't know if any of you speak Spanish, but I do. So in this case, we were able to walk the property and actually talk to them in Spanish and help them bridge that gap to ensure that they felt comfortable, they felt heard, and that we were able to provide them a solution that would essentially help them feel comfortable that this house might be a good fit. When we initially spoke to them about their situation, usually what we try to do is just try to listen a little bit more, just trying to understand what's happening with their situation, how urgent their need is. Now, keep in mind, they had only been in the hotel room for maybe 2 weeks, but we know situations that sometimes they last a month, maybe 2 months before they can find housing. So, fortunately, we were able to connect with them directly. Now, this particular agent, they work with State Farm. So it's a direct relationships. There's no third party company, there's no third party connectors, and there's no ALE or CRS involved. This is essentially something that goes directly to the actual insurance company. Now, in this case, as you can see here, the date goes from February 10th all the way through July. So in this case, it's a 6-month placement. If you guys have done insurance placements in the past where it's a complete loss, you'll quickly realize that possibly 6 months is not long enough for them to be able to completely rebuild a complete loss of a house. But that's essentially what they were looking for. Basically, they got a couple of bits out to the property, they saw it as a complete loss, and essentially the restoration company quoted them to be able to complete on about 6 months for that particular project. So we settled on 6 months. In this case, we were asking around 4,200. Now, because this is a direct booking, the main thing for us and what we're trying to do, we could have possibly charged maybe $6,000 a month. and go along the side of CRS and what they were already quoting to State Farm. But because we value that relationship and we want to maintain it long term, we're okay losing a little bit of money in the short term to be able to essentially retain that customer for future bookings. So we're willing to forego a couple thousand of bucks, even though we could have charged maybe $6,000 a month to be able to maintain and win that relationship, knowing that in future instances they'll be able to reach out to us and understand that this is likely going to be something that we can continue nurturing and developing that relationship. So in this case, it's a 6 month booking, but honestly, we've had instances where some homeowners have stayed with us for nearly a year. Right now, we're hosting a family that's actually relatively close to this property for about a year and a half now. And they've actually had to involve public adjusters too to essentially extend their lease. So in this case, the book value for those 6 months is roughly around $25,000 for that contract. Now there's cleaning fees. Of course, there's their initial series. So it's a homeowner that signed or the tenants that signed as well. That's just to make sure that you guys have visibility of that proof. But essentially, this is what we're looking at, right? We're trying to provide a solution. They've been displaced for about 2 weeks, and then they were looking for something pretty quickly. They found this property. You saw the images, the quality of the properties that we're trying to provide. And so they were essentially sold on the first day. There's sometimes that we do have to follow up, but if you have quality furnishings, if you have quality housing, you're responding pretty quickly. And then in my instance, I speak Spanish, so I was able to bridge that gap in terms of the translation. That's definitely a plus. So we were able to win this contract. Total value 25,000 in terms of this book value. Now it doesn't stop there. That same agent actually refer us. So agents, they're pretty well connected. They have other agents in their network, and they actually knew of someone down in Columbus that actually had housing or had some issues in terms of some people that had lost their home. If you guys remember, just a couple of weeks, there was basically a historical snowstorm. January had been the busiest month that we had ever since we've been in business. And we've been in business since 2019. I can say with certainty that January last month had been the busiest for us. So obviously, we're making pretty good money and we're providing housing and accommodations for those clients. But just know that we don't expect that to happen quite often just because it's historical snowstorms. We literally had, I think in some instances, we had 13 inches of snow. It got pretty high. And so in terms of the properties that essentially had fire or burst pipes, in this case, it was some burst pipes that they had. We don't expect that to happen every time, but it's good that we're prepared for something like that if it does happen and to provide that to our community. So in this case, essentially the story is this couple essentially they had been displaced for about a month. They had been living from a hotel. It's a couple with their son and two cats. So in this case, we needed something to be pet friendly. I know in some instances there's some guests that don't accept pets at all, or some only accept dogs, or you don't even take on cats. This one we actually won because they actually have show cats. So if I understand correctly, show cats is more like show dogs where they can do tricks. They're pretty well trained. So we actually, even though this property is a little bit more towards dogs, we were willing to take on the additional risk with additional deposit and fees, as well as some insurance coverage as well. But essentially, from this case, the family was displaced because they had a water heater, and that water heater, because of how cold it had been for the last couple of months, essentially the piping that was connecting to the water heater froze, and then essentially once they turned on the water heater, basically that pipe exploded from the heat and the cold. So what ended up happening is they essentially had all the water from the water heater sip into essentially their flooring. It was essentially in their kitchen flooring. And then one of the things that's actually interesting about this situation, the house, from what I understand, is like a historical house. It's actually kind of old. Some of the walls, essentially, basically, so they have the walls, they have the water heater, the water went up slightly, and those walls were made from like original wood. So what that meant is that water seeped in through the wall, and then what would have been probably maybe a couple of inches of water damage just into the flooring actually ended up extending into the walls. All that water just basically got absorbed into the walls, and essentially they were gone for the weekend. So at that time, since they weren't really home, they weren't really paying attention. basically that costs basically exponential damage after that. So what they're thinking, at least for the in terms of the renovation company, they're thinking it's possibly going to be 3 months. I feel like it's probably going to be closer to 4 months, but I don't think it's going to extend farther than that. Usually, with that type of more controlled damage, compared to a complete loss, the length of stay is a little bit shorter. Now, this particular one, what you'll see here in a minute is that it's actually going to be rented again by another client that we had. But because of the connection that we have from the one in Indianapolis to the person that was based in Columbus, they basically gave us a direct referral. Now, this particular one, it's a property that we own. So this is, like I mentioned, it's a property that we actually got a conventional loan. We furnished it. So essentially, the majority of this money is going to come to us. When it comes to co-hosting this other property that I mentioned, only a percentage will come to us in terms of direct payout. The majority of this gets paid to the homeowner that's taking a lot of the risk. So just know even though we don't put any money towards co-hosting, we're making some money, but the vast majority is going to go to the homeowner. In this case, the majority of it is going to come to us because essentially it's going to be paying our mortgage, it's going to pay all your utilities, and the majority of the net revenue that we get is going to come to us for this 3 months. Now, in this particular case, it's literally a couple of days ago they moved in, love the house, and they've been staying with us for a couple of days. The nice thing about this is that they're also referring us to their adjuster. So in each one of the houses, there's actually different adjusters, and then there's also different agents. What that means is that the agent in Indianapolis, they have their own adjuster. So right there is a point of two contacts that we can continue to do business essentially until they end their career or they retire. In this second case, it's another agent, and they have their own adjuster for this particular request. So right there is another 2 points of contacts that we can continue to do business with. And then in the last one, it's actually a different adjuster, but it's still the same agent. So technically, from just these three properties, we're getting a total of 5 different points of contacts that they can give us leads again and again and again. And we don't have to go and register with ALE. We don't have to go and register with CRS. We don't have to book ourselves an Airbnb and depend on that algorithm. We essentially have 5 points of contact that every time there's an issue in either one of those locations, will be top of mind and we can continue to service those locations. In this case, in the last case, this one's a 8-month booking. We ended up giving a quote of $3,750 per month. In this case, it's a little bit weird because this property over in Central Avenue, we actually already have bookings through a corporation. We're providing intern housing for a local company down in Columbus, Indiana. We're providing housing for basically all of their intern workforce for a couple of different states. But from May through August, it's already booked. And actually, this property is already booked until the 26th with another company. So what we ended up doing is we ended up saying, you guys, I know your displays right now, they're actually staying with their parents. This was a complete loss. It was a single mom, her 2 kids, and then they also had 2 dogs. So 2 medium-sized dogs. And they actually needed a fenced-in backyard. They live out in the country, so they actually wanted more space for the dogs. So both of the properties that we offer for the solution, both of them have fully fenced-in backyards, so that dogs can enjoy being outside, waste some energy, and be able to just essentially have some fun while they're there. So that was very important for them, just making sure that the dogs had a safe space for them to run around. There's no open areas where they could just go into the streets. So for them, it was a little bit of following up. This one actually, we ended up showing them a couple of properties. I think we ended up closing on this contract after 2 weeks of follow up with this place, single mom, until we were able to finally come up with a solution that would work best for her and her family. So in this case, what we ended up doing is we went ahead and submitted the contract from February all the way through March, or through May. So that's only a couple of months. That's roughly about, let's say, March, April, May. So it's about 2 months and a half. From May through August, this property is already booked, so we couldn't actually place her continuously in that property. So knowing that we had this property in Cedar Crest booked until April, there's a gap in between for about a month. So between April 30th through the end of the lease of this one, which is May 16th, it's about a month and a half. We think likely this family that's staying here, a couple with a kid and the two cats, they'll probably end up staying with us all the way through May, but more than likely they won't go past May. So there's roughly about 2 weeks gap there that we could maybe do short term if we wanted to, but more than likely we'll just eat the two weeks and then just move on. Anyway, in that case, right away that same property in Cedar Crest or in Cedar Crest, which is this one, is going to be booked. What that means is that the family will be staying over in the Central Avenue house, and then right away they'll go ahead and relocate to this other property. So we're not losing a beat, right? We're providing them a solution with properties. In this case, we're renting this property, and then we're moving them on to a property that we own. Or maybe if it worked out well, we could even do a property that we would co-host. So notice one property we own, two that we don't own, but we're still able to make it work. So it's all about making sure that you're creative, you're providing solutions, what in a way that's the most benefit to the client. So in this case, they're basically moving from May 16 to the new property in May 17, and then they're going to be there until the end of October. Now, this property, it was also a complete loss. So notice in the very first one, they're saying, "Oh, we'll probably be there for only 6 months." It's a complete loss. It's a much bigger house than what the original, the other homeowners lost. But just keep in mind that discrepancy, right? In one side, they're saying for us to completely build a brand new house, it's going to take about 6 months. On the other hand, they're saying it's going to take roughly 8 months, right? So notice that discrepancy, right? 6 to 8 months. More than likely, at least the reason why it led us to believe is that if it's going to take about 8 months for this house to be built, more than likely the first one will end up having some extension. In this case, for the eighth month, I don't know that it would necessarily have that extension, but it could still. But at least for the first one, we already know more than likely it's going to end up extended anyway. So we'll go ahead and block off some future dates to ensure that if they do end up extending, we can continue that contract. So once it's all said and done, we provided housing for 3 families. We've also made 5 new connections that are going to be repeating and continues to give us money. In terms of the length of stay, one is going to be for 3 months, one of it's going to be for 6 months, and then the other one's going to be for 8 months. On average, the length of stay is about 5.6 months. And then in total book value, we're going to be getting roughly around 66,000 for just those 3 properties. So if you guys think about this is essentially a full-time salary for someone just working in the US on average for the full year. And keep in mind, only one of the properties that we own. One of them we rent, and the only money that we put into that is the actual furnishings plus a deposit. And then the other one is a co-hosting property, which means that we haven't really put any funds of our own into that particular property, and instead we're going to be getting commission based on the total value of that. So let's say here, when you have a question, so there's a couple of questions, so I'll go ahead and answer those. I'll go ahead and stop sharing, but that's essentially what we ended up getting, right? So those connections, the book value, and then potential repeat business going forward. So let me read this question. So since rents are considered considerably higher than long-term rents, why are some individuals barely cash flowing unless this is what you were saying at the beginning? Is there considerable overhead? So what's happening, Wayne, is that if you go out into the open market and you get a mortgage, right now, at least what we're seeing is that based on the current interest rates, if you were to get a 30-year mortgage, from what we're seeing in these locations, let's say for example, your mortgage payment is $2,000. When it comes down to the actual rental, you might be getting maybe $1,700 or $1,800 a month. So what that means is that if you go all year round, you might be making $2,400 for the entire year in terms of cash flow. If something just goes wrong, like a water heater goes out, let's say it's $1,000, basically you lost half of your income that you got for that year. Now, the reason why someone would actually consider arbitrage to work with us, think about some of the costs that they have whenever they're giving it to a property management company. Typically, let's say for example, you have a mortgage for 2,000, and let's say you rent it for 2,200. Out of that 2,200, more than likely you'll be paying roughly about 10%. I think on average it's about 10%, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less in different locations. But at least from what I've seen, it's about 10%. So essentially, you're going to be paying $120 out of your potential cash flow to a property management company. That's assuming they actually rent it at that rental rate. So in that case, not only are you're losing about 10%, you also have long-term tenants that may or may not be of good quality. What that means is that after a year, if they stay in your property, they may have caused some damage to your property. You might have to replace a couple of things. You might have to fix a couple of things. So in terms of why they should work with us is because we're saving them 10% of the management fee. That's something that they don't have to pay. In addition to that, they are taking a little bit of risk because essentially what we're telling them is we're not going to actually live in the property, but we hope that you trust us enough that whoever we're placing here is going to take care of your property. Right. So they're taking a little bit of a risk because they're not doing the background checks, they're not doing the credit checks. They don't know who these people are who are moving in. So for us to make that pitch, what we're telling them is, I know you're typically rented for $2,200 a month. We'll go ahead and pay you $2,300 a month instead, just for that additional risk. So not only are they're saving the $120 each month, they're also making $100 more. What that means is that not only are they cash flowing their $200, $300, they're saving $200 on top. So essentially it's 400 plus we're paying them $100 more. So essentially what they're doing and the benefit as to why they work with us is because they're 2xing at least their cash flow. So not only are we giving them better tenants, we're 2xing their long-term rent. The other thing to consider is most of our guests are staying with us for about 3 months. What that means is that essentially we're going to have turnover or roughly about 3 months. So we're going to have cleaners there, we're going to have inspections there. We also are scheduling regular maintenance. So more than likely, the house will be kept up throughout their stay. So whenever you're pitching arbitrage, think about those things. What are some of the pain points they have, and what are some of the solutions that you offer? What's your value proposition for that landlord that's currently in pain? Right? Two ads, long-term rents, better quality tenants, and then regular maintenance and upkeep. Those are usually some of the three things that when we pitch rental arbitrage to some landlords, should they get sold. Not only are you two Etsy my cash flow, you're telling me I'm going to be more hands off and completely passive. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Great question. Any other questions? Anything else that you guys want to share, or do you want to share, or anything else that the group wants to share? All right. It looks like I just have you, Wayne. Anything else that you want to talk about? So essentially, that's the end of the lesson. I walked you guys through essentially the three different scenarios, how we were able to manage those relationships, and ultimately how everyone benefited from these interactions. All right. If there's nothing else, I'll go ahead and call the meeting. Just let me know if there's anything else that comes up, and we'll go from there. All right. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.